If you remember where we left off, it had to do with focusing mostly on what a crisis is. So we're all on the same page. The collapse in production, the laying off of people, and the ramifications as that spreads like dropping a stone in a pond, as the ripples of these sudden downturns play themselves out in the economy. But where we stopped was on looking a little bit at how this impacts the government, and then how the government's adjustments to this situation feed back on the economic crisis. And there I want to talk to you about it, partly because it's in the news every day now, and it's important for you to understand, but it's also part of every crisis, this interaction between the private economy and the government. The first thing to note, and the most important, is that when you have a sudden drop in production and a sudden laying off of people, unemployment rising, all governments lose money. It's a very crucial thing that you understand that. For example, federal government and state governments rely specifically, and to a great extent, particularly the federal government, on income taxes. That's the way they raise money. And the way the tax works is it's a percentage of your income. If you're an individual, it's your personal income. If you're a business, it's your profits. And those are taxed. And if businesses are going out of business or cutting back, and if people are losing their jobs, their income is falling, and therefore the percentage of that income that they used to pay in taxes is falling as well. So governments left and right are losing money because the incomes being earned by individuals and businesses are going down, and their tax revenues depend on it. But that's not all. The second most important resource for the government are sales taxes, or excise tax. Taxes on expenditures, they're called. They're a tax the government gets not when you earn income, but when you spend money, which is a different act. You are all taxed many times. You're taxed on your income when you earn it. Then when you turn around and spend the part of your income that isn't taxed, you get taxed again on that. Nor is that the end. Everybody is taxed multiple times. So an expenditure tax is very important. A sales tax, for example, that you pay here in New York every time you buy most of the things you buy. So that revenue, since people are buying less and conserving their money and they have less to spend, sales tax revenues are down. And finally, at the local level, the most important tax of cities and towns is the property tax, tax on land, buildings, businesses. And as the values of property go down, as they are across the United States now, the tax that you can levy will go down too. There's a lag. It doesn't happen right away the way sales taxes and income taxes drop right away. There's a lag because properties have to be reassessed for the tax to go down. But every government level loses money. That's basically what you're reading about now when you read about Governor Patterson invoking emergency steps to try to cope with the deficit. Or some of you may have noticed a lot of attention being given to Schwarzenegger in California because they have a deficit over $40 billion. Everywhere the federal government is losing its income, the state governments are losing their income, and the local governments are. Bloomberg is in all kinds of difficulty trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so what do the federal and state governments do? Well, right away there's a difference, and that's a legal point that I made last time, but some of you asked me about it, so let me repeat it to you. The law in the United States allows the federal government to borrow money when the taxes go down and they need to keep spending on programs. They can do that. State and local governments are not allowed to do that. The reason for that is American history. It's a long history of thinking that when you allowed state and local governments to borrow money to get themselves out of trouble, they went and borrowed much too much and they got themselves into trouble. So a law was passed saying they can't do it. So the local governments can't. That's why you will see so much agony at the level of the state and the local. And you don't see that at the level of the federal. They just seem to be able to spend money like it's going out of style because they're legally free to do it. But governors can't and mayors can't, and that's why you will read that sort of thing. So the federal government reacts to the collapse of its revenue by having to make two decisions. It either cuts back spending. Government can do that. It's getting less money in, it spends less. The trouble with that is it'll make the economic crisis worse, since the problem begins by individuals losing their jobs and being unable to spend, and businesses losing their customers and therefore being unable to spend. If the government joins them and likewise cuts back its spending, the whole thing is gone. The economy becomes a free fall. So the federal government doesn't do that. In fact, what the federal government says is, wow, if anything, as everybody else is spending less money, we have to compensate by spending more money, which is what they're doing. When you hear stimulus plan, when you watched that last week and the week before, Obama got through and was very proud in signing a bill for the federal government to spend an additional $800 billion, big number, pumping money in. Okay, let's follow the logic here. The government is now going to spend, and the idea is the extra spending by the government will helpfully keep the economy going because it offsets, it compensates for the reduced spending by individuals, by businesses who are cutting back because of the economic problem. So we ask the government to come in and compensate for the private economy's breaking down, not functioning, cutting back. The state and local governments can't do that. So in fact, what the state and local governments are doing as they cope with declining taxes, since they can't borrow, the state and local governments actually make the problem worse. It's a peculiarity of our culture and of our economy. Let's see how. Well, I'm going to take the example of California. It's the biggest state in the Union. So as they go, so goes the nation in many ways, including this one. What did Schwarzenegger and the state Senate and the state House of Representatives in California just do? They worked out a deal to cover a $41 billion deficit. That's the difference between what they would have needed to get to keep going with everything that California was doing. All the state universities, all the highways, all the harbors, all the education of the children, etc., etc. They would have needed $41 billion more than they're now getting because the economy has gone through the toilet. California's been very badly hit by the downturn in real estate. If you walk through the streets of San Diego, you will see every third house is for sale. It's much worse than anything that has happened in this part of the country, at least so far. We may see that. I even notice here on 6th Avenue, as many of you have, that the number of stores that have a for rent sign is clearly different than what it was 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago. No one knows how bad it's going to get. But there it is really bad, as it is in San Francisco and LA and so forth. So they have $41 billion, too little money. They're not allowed to borrow and spend. They can't. So what did they decide to do? Two things. About half of the 41, this is very rough, half of the $41 billion is going to be handled by cutting expenditures by the state. The state is going to, if we're getting less than $41 billion less than we need to keep going, we're going to cut our expenditures by $20 billion. Well, that's an example of the state making the problem worse. That is, joining the individuals who are cutting back and the businesses who are cutting back. The government's going to cut back. It's going to lay off teachers and firefighters and wardens in the jail and whoever else they cut. And the other half, this will blow you away too, the other half of the $41 billion shortfall is going to be handled by raising taxes. So the way they will handle their $41 billion shortfall is raise $20 billion more in taxes and cut government spending, state spending of California, by $20 billion, and that together will deal with their problem. And what does it mean if they raise $20 billion more in taxes? It means people who might have had that money to spend won't, because the government is taking it from them. So the irony is that California, like every other state, is going to be cutting back its own spending and reducing the spending of the public by taxing them more to cope with the economic situation. Now, if it strikes you that that doesn't make sense, good. That's the point. Yeah.
Has there been any lobbying to change the law?
Yes. States have been trying on and off to do that. And it has been the fear, particularly of the private sector, that giving the states the authority to borrow would lead them into a level of indebtedness that is, in some sort of long-run sense, even more dangerous to the economy than this short-run problem. But that's a debate. I'm not arguing that's right or wrong, but that's a debate. Yeah?
Can there be any middle and to limit the amount states can borrow instead of saying you can't borrow at all?
Yeah, you could make a rule. That would be a compromise. Give them some limited authority. They technically have that because states and cities can borrow, but they're not allowed to borrow for ongoing budgetary problems. They can borrow for what are called capital projects, when they make a big change in the community, build a new sewer, build a school, extend a hospital. That kind of thing, which is not a normal business income outflow, then they can borrow. And all cities and towns do that. So now, if you get a creative accountant, you can do a budget by playing games with your capital, and they all do that. But they have to watch that. They're looked at, and they're covered by that. Okay, stay with me about this. Let's go back to the federal government. It has the right, and it is doing what we would expect it to do. This is what Keynesian economics, in a sense, taught the state to do. When the economic downturn comes, you spend more, because you're the really only offset left. Individuals are cutting back, as you all know. Many of you are doing that. Businesses are cutting back. They have no choice. They have no customers. And now the state and local governments cut back. If the federal government didn't go the other direction, who would save us? So the government does. But that immediately raises a new problem. The solution of every problem is always a new problem, if you understand the dialectic, as Hegel once called it. So here's the federal government's problem. In order for all this to work, in order for the government to be able to do this, as you recall, it has to do one of two things, the federal government, to have all this money to spend. They're not going to raise taxes, because that would be self-negating, that's self-defeating. If the government raises the taxes to spend more, then it's going to cut back on the spending of all the people it taxes, which will offset its extra spending. That's pointless. So it's got to go one of two other ways. It has to borrow the money, or it has to print the money, literally print the money. It doesn't want to do the last thing because that's scary, because all that money could start looking for goods, and then we would have an inflation, and that's a whole nother can of worms. And they may end up doing that if nothing else works. But that's their last resort. That's their last resort. So the borrowing is what they're doing. That's the focus. The plan of Mr. Obama is to, that $800 billion that was just passed, the plan is to borrow all of it and pump that money into the economy. If the borrowing doesn't work, and this, understand this, because the newspapers never bring this question up, even though some of you, as really, just thinking as an intelligent person you might wonder, at some moment when you read all these things, the enormous sums that the government is going to spend, and they're not raising the taxes, even if you didn't put it into words, that they would have to go borrow it. And then the thought would occur to you, like any borrower would, will people lend to me these big sums? So we're going to come to that. But let's assume for the moment, just simply, that it doesn't work. People won't lend. Then they'll print the money. Then we'll have this philosophical debate, real practically. And Mr. Obama or some other spokesman for the government will stand up and say to all of us, yes, it's true, we're printing money at a vast scale. But don't worry. And then your argument will be made. There's lots of people who need jobs. There's lots of capacity. Factory space, machines. We can produce more stuff. And if extra money has more stuff, then there won't be an inflation. Then there won't be extra money chasing after too few goods, because the extra money will bring forth the very goods that will undercut any tendency towards inflation. It's as if you and I both want that ice cream cone on the corner. We both want it. But there's only one ice cream cone. And the vendor just has one. And then you and I approach and we look at each other, we look at the vendor, and we realize one of us is going to get that ice cream and one of us isn't, because there's only one and there's two of us. And the ice cream costs $1. You know what's going to happen. One of us is going to say to the vendor, I'll give you $1.50. In the hopes that the vendor, pleased, will give that ice cream to me because I offered $1.50 versus you who might stick with $1. But you're not a fool. You say, I'll give you $1.75. And that's an inflation as the prices go up of everything, because more money, right? The story presumes that you and I have enough money to bid. If there's more and more money coming in, there's more and more people who can bid. And up will go the prices. So the hope will be that the money somehow gets the vendor so excited that he arranges for more ice cream. Then there won't be a problem. And so there will be a debate in America. This could be something that's headline news 2 months from now, 3 months from now. Those lining up who say extra production is not going to happen and therefore the extra money will make an inflation, versus those who say, no, extra production will happen, we don't have to worry, print the money. And whoever wins that argument, that's what we'll do. And we will all live with the consequences, whatever they are. But we're not there yet, which is why that debate is in the back of the mind. It comes up in a good question, comes up in an unusual news story, very rare. Mostly we're all acting as though we're not at that point yet, so we don't have to worry about it. We can focus on the government borrowing the money. But I'm now going to explain to you what the costs are of the government borrowing the money. You know, I'm no fan of Republicans. I like them about the same as I like the Democrats. So for me, it's different. But pay attention, because the Republicans are saying exactly what, in a sense, they ought to be saying. I mean, the country's in trouble. That's clear. The majority of people feel that way. Obama is trying to bail us out of the situation. There's basically support for that. The Republicans have a tough situation. They lost the election, and now they look like they're, nitpicking at a time when you shouldn't be doing that. It's tough for them. So what they come up with is, however, not altogether nonsense. It isn't. And I hate to be somebody who tells you to take seriously what Republicans say. It hurts my feelings to even think about doing it, but I have no choice. I mean, there is a logic there. If you borrow like crazy to bail the economy out, which is what we're doing, that's what the Congress voted for it, Obama pushed it, he signed it, that's what we're doing. If you borrow a ton of money, you all understand, you're going to have to pay it back. And when the government has to pay it back, it's going to have to eventually tax businesses and people to get the money to pay it back. That's not an argument not to do it, because we're in such terrible trouble. You got to do something. But remember what I said. A solution to a problem is always another problem. Does not mean not to do it. If you think you're going to find a solution that produces no problem, good luck to you. It's never been done. You may be the first, but no one else has ever done it. So yes, Obama is doing something. He's going to borrow that money. But when the Republicans say, wait a minute, we're all going to have to pay, that's correct. They're right. Sure, they're right. That's not even the whole problem. If the Republicans were a little smarter in economics, they could say some other things, which I'm about to, which are also problems. But that's the one, that's all right. But what they're saying is not without any merit. That's really not the case. And that makes sense. They're going to have to find something if they're going to, hit at Obama, hit at the Democrats, which is what Republicans are there to do. Then they've found something to worry people about. Then they also make other arguments that are a little strange. But if the government is going to borrow for this big stimulus, it has to find lenders. And the first logical question to ask then is, well, who might the lenders be? Let's rule out some. The American people aren't going to lend to the American government because they don't have any money. Most of them have no chance to do that. And so the rich are there. They'll lend some money. But they're not exactly flush these days. And so that's a bit of a problem. Much of the lending that the government has been able to get has been, as you point out in your question, from outside the United States. We've been borrowing now for quite some years. An enormous and growing percentage of the debt of the United States is to foreigners. foreign individuals, foreign businesses, foreign governments, all of whom, for the reasons you mentioned and many others, lend to the United States government. It is still the government where, if you're a rich capitalist, it's a good place to have your money. And it's often a better place to have your money than the country in which you live and of which you are a citizen, where things are shaky, and it's always good to have a nice apartment on Fifth Avenue, even if no one's ever in it except your cousin Frank, who visits the United States twice a year for a week. If you doubt me, talk to any realtor in New York City, in Manhattan particularly, and you will learn what an immense proportion of the apartments in the pickiest areas of the city are owned by people who are never there. You go in the evening and look on Fifth Avenue, and the windows are all dark. Nobody's in there much of the year, because these are not homes. These are investments. They are places to put money for safekeeping if you're a wealthy person in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, or anywhere else. Very important. Anyway, foreigners have been lending to the United States government. So the hope of the Obama administration is that they will continue to do so. That they will continue to do so because we're still the best bet, although we're not quite as secure as we used to be. And they still need the United States not to fall apart, because they all sell here in the United States, in these other countries. And if the United States falls apart, they are in a sense shooting themselves in the foot by letting the United States fall apart. So they can't.
Also reserve currencies, so they'll lose all their accumulated wealth.
Yeah, they own a lot of dollars, so if the United States falls apart and the value of the dollar goes with it, they're sitting there holding this stuff. But all of those arguments work two ways. That is, they notice, because they own so many dollars, that there are too many dollars in the world compared to what the United States is worth. And therefore they have to hold more of them, but they don't want to hold more of them. They're a lender who sees the borrower in deeper and deeper trouble. So it becomes prudent to go, well, I don't want him to fall apart, but just in case he falls apart, I don't want him to take me down with him. It's a very old problem. And the rest of the world, you can see it already. Over the last 12 months, the flow of foreign lending to the United States has slowed dramatically. Has changed its form. For example, foreigners have dumped securities. They have dumped long-term debt. They've gone into short-term. They don't trust the United States. They're shifting from, say, a U.S. Treasury, a debt to the a loan to the United States that has to be paid back in 20 years. They've sold that and moved the money instead into something that the government has to pay back in 3 months. Because they want to watch. They want to have the option that if things look terrible, they're not stuck in a long-term loan. They want a short-term loan, which is one of the reasons why short-term debt has changed in America relative to long-term debt. But the most important point, and not the technical points, the big picture. Keep in mind the big picture. The United States is now the world's greatest debtor country. Nobody else is close. Already. The new stimulus is going to make the biggest debtor bigger still. That's not an endless that can't go on. At a certain point, lenders are going to say it's too dangerous to keep accumulating. They won't disaccumulate all at once. That would be crazy. That'll provoke. So they'll all try to do it slowly. They'll all try to bail before everybody gets panicked. But if everybody's doing that, you're going to get the panic. Everyone's going to begin wondering. Everyone is already, I shouldn't make this in the future, it's already here. There are discussions and debates. The Chinese financial officials are making statements now almost every other week, talking about how they're going to slow down the accumulation of American debt, how they're getting nervous about that, how they're moving money into other things, etc., etc. And they are. It's clear. We know enough to know that this is going on. So the Obama administration is about to try to, get the picture, offset the decline in individual spending and business spending by pumping more money in, spending more, and they're going to do it by borrowing money. The hope is they will be able to do it. And not only is this a question of will the money be there, and the answer is we don't know. We really don't know. And the Obama administration does not want to publicly ask the question because it makes the situation worse. If they were to admit that we might not, what kind of panic would then ensue as everybody begins to ask the question, I'm asking you now, what happens if we can't find lenders? Just like in you, if you were desperate in your situation to survive and you needed to find a lender and you had to face the question, what are you going to do in your own personal life if there's no lender to help you? You're going to have to then face choices you're going to have to make you don't want to face about your personal life and your existence and everything else. The United States doesn't want to do that. That's very scary. But even if we can borrow, here's a couple of scenarios to keep in your mind. Maybe the rest of the world will say, yeah, we'll lend to you, but we don't trust you. You're in deep trouble. You're spending like there's no tomorrow. You're borrowing like there's no tomorrow. Your own people may revolt against paying the taxes that will be necessary to repay these loans. Suddenly, the United States will become treated like every other country in which you ask as a foreign investor, not just what the government says and wants, but how secure is the government? At what point will the government run afoul of its own people, and then commitments that are made by the government will not be worth the paper they're printed on, because the mass of people who in the end have to make good on what the government commits won't do it. That doesn't just happen in other places. That's going to happen here too. And the rest of the world is realizing that that's a possibility. That's why the Republicans are important. They're already talking about, no, we're not going to pay the taxes. They're building a tax revolt strategy. They want to be the political beneficiaries of the upset in the American people as the bill for all of this borrowing. They see themselves as making some political hay out of this situation. And that's right. They ought to. That's the situation that lends itself to them. Well, here's what the world might do if they think the United States is becoming less and less secure as a borrower. They will do what lenders always do. What do they do if they think you're not a good risk? Answer: they either don't lend to you, or they lend to you and demand higher interest to compensate them for what they perceive is the higher risk of lending to you. So the rest of the world will say, okay, we'll lend to you, Mr. Obama. We'll give you the $800 billion you want to spend. We understand the point of it. We're even in agreement, because it helps us too to keep you afloat. But we're not doing it the way we used to, because you're presenting us with risks. So you got to pay us a higher interest rate. Wow, if the United States has to pay higher interest, if interest rates go up, we have a whole new set of problems. A rising interest rate means, generally, that the cost of buying things on credit goes up for everybody. Every business will now have a higher interest rate. Every individual who buys a house or a car on time will have higher payments. It's not good for the car industry, which barely surviving as it is. Less people will buy cars, less people will buy homes. The price of homes will go down if less people buy homes because the interest rate is too high. The price of housing is already collapsing, and that's very bad for the... You get the picture? This is a very thorny question. And one sign of how serious this crisis is that we are so desperate to do something, like the stimulus plan, that we don't want to ask these questions. They're put aside. They're bracketed. We're not to worry. Either because there's no problem there, that's crap, but a lot of people will say that because they're afraid. Or the more honest answer, which you will get in Washington, is if we don't solve this problem now, all these other conversations will be academic, in the worst sense of the term academic. So it's kind of, yeah, maybe, but what choice have we got? We have to. And there's a lot of support for that position on both sides. Whatever they say publicly, they understand this kind of issue. But you should be aware that if the government borrows, it may have to pay higher interest rate with all those problems. If the government borrows, that's going to have to be paid back, and that's a problem. And we're even not done. Here's the third problem with the government borrowing. When the government borrows and soaks up all the money that can be lent, then there isn't any money lent to the private sector. It means businesses. It's called in economics crowding out. The government is crowding out the private borrower because it's literally soaking up all the lendable money. It's desperate, it has to do it, but it creates difficulties. Serious difficulties, because other companies that might have been able to get the money to keep going won't be able to. Or on much less attractive terms. They'll have to give it back sooner. They'll have to pay more points. They'll have to pay a higher interest rate. They'll have to give over more control to the lender than they would like for their all those kinds of pressures begin to build up because nobody who's a lender wants to lend to the private because it's risky. You prefer to lend to the government, which promises you that they will guarantee to pay back. And the government is a more reliable borrower than the private. So between the government soaking it up and the government being the preferred lender anyway, the preferred borrower, businesses who are already complaining that credit is tight may be complaining much more loudly. And again, the answer to them is, yes, that's true, it's a problem. But if we don't do this, the game is up. It's all for you signs of how very, very serious this crisis is, beyond anything that is still being admitted most of the time. Yeah.
It might sound like a stupid question, but if the United States doesn't have any big money reserves anywhere, it's going to have to borrow all the 800 billion.
Or print it. Now, of course, the government could take. I don't want to do this yet because partly it'll scare you. But there, of course, is always an alternative. In every country that reaches this crisis point, there is, of course, an alternative. And the rest of the world may force this on us. The rest of the world will say, I'm not lending you anything. But I'll tell you what I'll do to the government. I will give you money to spend, but you got to give me something that I want. And another debt from you, I don't want. Well, what do you want? Mr. Obama would say. And the answer, now don't laugh, I'll take Oklahoma. Careful, this happens all the time. We will give them property. If they will give us the money to allow the government to do what it has to do to get out, and what we have to do is start giving them the wealth of the United States, they will. That's what other countries do. Yeah.
We have military bases all over the world that could be sold.
Absolutely. Could sell military bases. The United States companies own facilities all around the world. We could sell those. The government might do a survey and go to a company and say, we're very sorry, General Motors, you have a lovely factory here in northern Germany. You've had it for 50 years. It's called the Opel Company. It's very nice. You have 12 days to sell it. Good luck. Find somebody. That's it. And then we'll work out something with you. You'll get paid, but you'll immediately lend it to the government, this money. And blah, blah, blah. Well, if you're at the end, if you have a basic crisis and you don't have the wherewithal to solve it without these measures, you have to start thinking of measures. What you're watching here is the slow, steady erosion of the position of the United States that it has held for much of the last 100 years. That is being undermined. It is still a very strong position. Don't misunderstand. The United States position is still very wealthy, still very strong. But it's not what it was. And that process is what all these deals, this changing, this is not complicated. If Brazil is showing more and more difficulty and shrinkage of its interconnections with the United States, while there's an expansion of its interconnections and dependence with China, you don't need an advanced degree. They're going to change their politics and they'll change their global position and change where they think they ought to spend their money and change who they ought to support in the UN, etc., because it's a question of their survival. The United States' position keeps shrinking. The United States' political position is much weaker than it was. Its economic position is much weaker. The one thing that the United States still has unquestionable dominance in is the scariest thing of all, which is its military. And in the history of the human race, if you're losing your political ideological and economic muscle and influence, and you have something that still is dominant in the world, the temptation to make what you have reaffirm what you're losing is not small. And you can see across America the people who think like that. The people in the Bush administration, there were a lot of those who thought like that. There are fewer of those who think like that in Obama, but they're there too. And that's a part of American politics, as it would be in any other society. But it's a danger I don't want you to distract you from, but it's not quite what the course is about. And none of you should be under any illusion, no matter how smooth the president of this or that country is, including our own, and how confident, projecting that image, that's very nice, but that's not the reality. That's the persona, it's not the reality. Not here, nowhere else either. If you put all the levels of government together, if you put the federal, state, and local, it's by far the biggest employer. No private employer comes anywhere near that. So in terms of just the sheer magnitude of the number of people whose personal income depends on a check from some level of government, that's bigger than any particular private industry. By a law, it's not even close. On the other hand, the majority of people are employed in the private sector in the United States. If you add up all the private employees, and put against them the government is much smaller total than the total private sector. It's more of a private economy than a government economy in our society. And that's been true pretty long. The role of the government has gotten larger pretty steadily for 50, 60 years, but it is still a minority of the total employing class. The business about small employees, small companies and big companies, that's a bit of a charade. This economy is dominated by large corporations. But the way the large corporations dominate is not only by employing people. So, for example, General Motors dominates an enormous swath of industry. But much of that industry is organized as little companies who produce, a carburetor ring or a plastic strap that holds your some piece of equipment in your car seat to the underside of the seat. And there are historical reasons and tax reasons why it's more profitable to have this piece of stuff made in a little company with 11 people outside of Detroit rather than in the River Rouge plant or in a big company. But the idea that this is a little business which is somehow independent, that's silly. That's just silly. That is, a huge portion of these small companies are completely dependent on one or two or three large companies for whom they are feeder suppliers. And it's really a detail of law and accounting that they're kept independent. And you can actually see it. When the law changes, they're swallowed up again and become the divisions of the big one. When the law shifts, they are separated out again. But that's an arrangement that the people who actually are in these industries understand very well. They're not independent. So it's a little bit of a misleading number to count that way. 500 corporations do 2/3 of the business in the United States. That's what you need to understand. This is not about economics. This is theater. Just theater. And that's why they have all those advisors who make sure they're dressed in a certain way and made up in a certain way and have the lighting in a certain way and have the flag over here and a small dog over there, all that. Okay. Let's go back. When the government is in trouble, as it is now, and I'm thinking particularly of the state and local governments, stay with me as you understand now the feedback. If the state governments cut back, which they're doing everywhere, City of New York is going to cut back, the state of New York is going to cut back, California just announced $1 billion worth of cutbacks. So what are we going to have? We're going to have less spending by the state government on buying objects and hiring people. And of course, with the fewer objects that they buy, some company is going to have fewer customers because the government's cutting back. And people are going to get laid off or moved from full-time to part-time. And they're going to have less money, and they're going to spend less money, which is less tax. In other words, the government's reaction to the economic downturn, in the case of state and local governments, always makes the downturn worse. One of the reasons Obama's plan that was passed last week has in it, I don't remember the numbers, between 200 and 300 billion, if I recall, aid to cities and states, is he's trying, which makes sense, to offset this impact that the states and cities, they all know, is going to have. But be aware, if one state alone, California, has 41 billion trouble in 1 year, and remember the 800 billion is for 2 years, plan of Obama. But if one, the biggest state, granted, but if one state has 41 in 1 year, and all you've got is, say, 300 billion for all the cities and states over 2 years, what do we know? We know that the government help to the cities and states won't begin to cancel out what is going to be done to the economy by the cutbacks of the city and state. When you hear people say what Obama is doing, what the Congress just did, I don't mean to pick him out. He's not the only one responsible for this, heaven knows. But what this package is that was passed is not going to be adequate. That's what people have in their mind. The amount of money given to the cities and states is not only not going to boost spending, which is the idea, it's not even going to offset the cutbacks that state and local governments are going to have to do in this society in the next year and a half, which is why the prognosis for this stimulus is poor. It's not because they make mistakes. It's not this or that thing. It's not the Republicans, we all have to pay. That's not the issue. It's a much simpler issue. The money isn't there from the federal help to the states and cities to offset what the states and cities already see that they're going to have to do. It's important to understand that. Second, there are going to be consequences of economic downturn that put new demands on the federal, state, and local governments. This is very hard to quantify, but we know it's there. For example, unemployed people have more illnesses, psychological and physical. Unemployed people and shuttered businesses and depressed communities have a whole collection of pathologies, from alcoholism to petty crime. All of that stuff puts new demands on medical facilities just as they're cutting back. New demands on police and fire as they're cutting back. Each community in its own way is going to be struggling with this absurd juxtaposition of reduced resources to meet growing social demand for the services that cities and towns and the federal government as well provide, or are supposed to provide, or are expected to provide. There's no way to know how this all plays out, but it is a scary proposition because of this juxtaposition, and it is going to put more strain on the economic system, much more strain. And typically it takes political forms, in the sense that as people get more squeezed, they look around for something to blame. Since they don't understand or pay attention to the economics all that much, it's easier to find a more ready-to-hand object of blame. Scapegoating becomes a very important thing. And you are every bit as good as I am in guessing who might be the candidate for scapegoating this time, right? You have a number of new phenomena. We have a different ethnic mix in our culture that creates possibilities. We have an absolutely new thing with a non-white president. What kind of stuff is that going to swirl around that? And blame games can begin with all kinds of twists. We have this background noise of a war against terror that no one quite understands who these people are or what they are, and whoever it is that the target is supposed to be. It's a mess, but it's very volatile, and that situation can spin in ways that are also very difficult. Okay, last thing. The culture here in the United States is also crucial. And in many ways, and I wish I had more time, but I don't. But one of the ways this culture works is that in our culture, when things go bad economically and politically, we have been trained as a culture to blame the political sphere. In other words, it's the president or the Congress or the mayor or some political entity that is blamed for there being distress, being unemployment, or whatever the problem is. And this serves nicely to keep the economic system kind of out of the story. It's upsetting that the economic system isn't working, but it's to the president and to the mayor, to the governor, we look to do something to fix this. And since the problem, I would argue to you, and I hope that what you've been reading helps to make this clear, since the problem is in the economy, brought to us by the economy, coming out of the way our economy functions, this cultural tendency to keep demanding of the political sector that it do something about the economic sector is bizarre, but also ineffective. Peculiarly ineffective. It's as if you kept having pains in a part of your body, and as you got upset and hurt, you went to the car mechanic and you said, what do I do? And it took a while for the car mechanic to say, what are you talking to me for? I fix your car. It's not your car, it's your leg that's bothering you. So it's a little bit like that in the United States. It's not shuffling this politician and substituting that one. What? What are you doing? This isn't changing what the problem. You're not dealing with the economic system, which is what's screwed up here and not working in the way that you need as a people. And so this disconnect was very peculiar to American culture. I've never seen it. And in any other culture, not that I'm not familiar with other cultures, but the little bit I know about European culture, they don't work like this. All I want you to see is that the economic crisis that we're in affects the political system profoundly, and in ways that are often such that the feedback makes the economic problem even worse than it would otherwise have been because of the complicated way that economics and politics are integrated in a society like the United States. And that when a crisis hits in the economic system, given the way that politics and economics work together, it's actually in many ways creating a whole nother set of problems layered on top of the economic problems. Even though the politics tries to offset and be a compensating, an offsetting phenomena, and in some ways it is. In other ways it spins and makes it worse, and in that complexity, that's where we sit. That's our problem. And that's why you'll see as much struggling with the politics as with the economics. Okay, enough of that. Let me turn now to what is section 2 of your reading list, which is an overview of the history of this particular crisis, which is what we're going to focus on. We've done all the preparatory work, the general theories and notions of crisis and how they work. Now we're going to look in detail at the one we're living through. And I would like to again direct you to that film that I told you about, which you can get here. Capitalism Hits the Fan. An illusion that I hope you all figured out. And the reason is that film is an attempt to give you this overview. So it'll be what I'm going to do today. I'm going to do it much more elaborated today, but it gives you a summary, in a sense, of that argument. Okay. This particular crisis, and by that I mean the one that hit in 2007/2008, and that we're now a year and a half into, has both a long history and a short one. And I'm going to give you the long and the short, first the long, then the short, so you can see. And why do I do that? Because, as I've told you, when we talked about capitalist crises, they happen every 3 to 7 years. But what we have now is not just another one of those business cycles. Because on top of the short-term business cycle, which indeed we have, we also have a long accumulated set of problems which make this particular short-term crisis very severe. That's why we need to talk a little bit about the long one. Okay, and we're talking about the United States. So we're going to take a long sweep of history. And the sweep of history runs like this. Some of you studied with me before, you will find some of this a little bit familiar. I'm going to draw a rough graph. And over here is 1820, long time ago in America. And over here is 1970. And I'm going to draw a line, and it looks something like that. And that line is the level of real wages for American workers. The average, by real wage, by the way, in economics, we distinguish between money wage, the money you actually get each week, and what you can actually buy with that. So we adjust the money wage for the prices you actually pay, so that we have a measure of how much stuff you can actually buy with the wages you get. The real wage is therefore the money wage adjusted for the prices. That's all. So this is a real wage measure. And for these 150 years in America, real wages went steadily up. I want to drive that home to you because that is absolutely crucial to understanding where we are now. And you'll see that once I go through it. First of all, look at that line. That line goes pretty much straight up. For 150 years, the average American worker took home or was able to buy with his or her wages more stuff with each passing year, more or less. That's stunning. Probably no other country in the world has ever had that. 150 years of pretty much uninterrupted. And for those of you that know, this includes the Great Depression. Why? Because in the Great Depression, the wages went down, but the prices went down more. You wouldn't mind so much if you got half your wage if the prices dropped by more than half. You'd be ahead. You could buy more stuff, even though your money was down. In any case, it went up for 150 years. It made the United States a bizarre, unique place. And it's important for you to understand that because you've all been told, those of you that are Americans at least, and maybe those of you that aren't too, American citizens, that there's something absolutely special and wonderful and unique, and God loves us and more than He loves everybody else and all that. Every American politician, right, begins or ends his or her speech, "This is the greatest country in the world." It's absolutely obnoxious, as Carlin used to say in one of his comedic riffs. Most obnoxious. What are you doing? I'm the greatest. You know what you do to a person in a bar who talks like that, right? Anyway, in American history, there's something to this. It is a remarkable story. And it produced in the United States a sense of itself as a chosen place. A place in which something happened that didn't happen anywhere else. It had something to do with a lot of people coming here from other countries because they thought it might happen here and they were pretty sure it wasn't going to happen there, and they were mostly right. This was a belief which got deeper and more widespread because it was mostly true. That was happening. Yeah, open the windows and cool it off unless that bothers somebody. Okay. For 150 years, rising wages. And this worked in America of profound effects on our economy and our society. First, it allowed a long period of time during which a peculiar gender division occurred in American life. The man goes out and gets the rising wage. The woman doesn't. She stays home. She cooks and cleans and raises the children and has a happy face when daddy comes home at the end of the day. What is sometimes called a family wage. This peculiar arrangement in which the woman is house person, child person, food person, cleaner upper, and all of that, is unthinkable without a wage that goes like that. You know how we know that? Because you all have given all of that up. You ain't going to do any of that. The men, for those of you that are women, the men that you connect to or live with and don't want you to do that, and you don't want to do it anymore either, that's over. You know that your standard of living can't do that. Can't do it. Even if you wanted to, you can't do that. And for many women, it's a tremendous difficulty. Now, for several generations, as they have to be broken from that old model, which their mother or grandmother still has deep in them, and the newer generation of women have to... This is not just a feminist issue and so on. It is that. But it's also an issue of how this economy evolved that even made that possible. That kind of peculiar division. Okay, second thing that happened. Americans got the idea that each generation will live better than the one before. That it is to be expected as your kind of birthright, as somehow built into this culture, that your parents live at a higher standard of living than your grandparents, and you more than your parents, and your kids will outdo you, and so forth. And it's just part of the American marvel, the American specialness, that this upward and onward, well, you can see what supports that idea, how and why that would develop, because it has its grain of truth. It also produced in America, I'm oversimplifying, but I want to make this point, it produced a peculiar union movement, labor movement. Part of the reason these wages went up was what unions fought for them. Unions were formed, fought, and part of this, not all of it, but part of this is attributable to what unions did. But it's very interesting that what unions did was to push for rising wages, which is interesting because they pushed for something in a society that was already happening. It's almost as if they played it safe. They pushed for something which then they could claim they had more than a little to do with. Dangerous thing for many people, taking credit for something that might have happened anyway. Who knows? But in America, unions pushed for that because that's what workers wanted. That's what workers thought they were entitled to. That's what the whole culture said was the name of the game. Work, very important now, was about earning money. You work hard, you earn more. American unions then are distinguished, and always have been, by being less interested than unions in other countries in changing the rules of the game, in changing how the business operates, in changing who has the power. That was not their interest. Their interest was make more money, get higher wage, get more days off, improve my real way. That's what it's all about here. Many unions have had struggles between those in the union who wanted to have a different vision of what a union does. It changes the whole way the society works. They were defeated most of the time by people who said, no, the job of the union is to get more for our members. Higher wages, better working conditions. That kind of unionism won in America. And it had a lot to do with this history that made that win. Lastly, this history of rising wages in America contributed to a very profound ideology, which is stronger in the United States than in most other countries. And I don't know what to call it, but I will call it consumerism. It is the notion that what life is about is consumption. There's a joke I'm sure you've all heard. Life is a game. The person who has the most stuff in his garage when you die wins. Accumulate. Have a nice house. Have a nice big house. Have 2 houses. Have a car. Have 2 of them. Accumulate. Have a kitchen with every gadget imaginable. have your basement filled with boxes of appliances you've never unpacked. If you have a white refrigerator, get rid of it and get an avocado refrigerator. Right? Have a machine that grinds your coffee as well as cooks it, etc. Right? It's a society in which consumption becomes an incredible value. I'm going to exaggerate. I am exaggerating because you'll see where this goes, but I'm not exaggerating by much. It's a society in which human beings begin to measure their own worth in terms of consumption. I'm an important person because I drive that car, I live in that neighborhood, I take my vacation over there, look at the outfit I'm wearing, look at the restaurant I'm dining in, etc., etc. I am, as every advertisement you've all seen says, I am a Rolex man, or whatever. That is, I literally become the things I can acquire. I'm successful, meaning, look at all the stuff I got. It's a society in which you're willing to do all kinds of things if the payoff is more stuff. If you ask people what kind of job they want, most Americans answer in ways that do not describe the work they will do, but rather describe the income they will get. I have a good job usually means a well-paying one. Not good in terms of how I interact with the other people I work with. Not good in terms of the social usefulness of the work I do. Not good in terms of the experience it has for me as it's how much money I earn. And that in turn is important because I can buy with the money. That's important because it means people think like that. They think about consumption. Consumption is crucial for them. Americans accept working conditions that are in many ways more pressured, more speed up, work very high intensity. And when you ask them, the few who understand it, why are you working at a pace which other people in advanced countries would not accept? Why do you do it? For those few who understand that that's the case, which it is, by the way, in case you don't know, the answer is, for the knowledgeable American, I want that amount of stuff. I want that. Americans work, right, for example, today, 20% more hours a year than Europeans, on the average. Do you understand that? For every 5 hours a European works, an American works 6 in a lifetime. That's amazing. Americans work their asses off to accumulate money to take, when they finally have enough, a trip to France and Italy where they admire the pace of life. But that's what they do. They come back and say, these are marvelous people. They go out to dinner at 7 and they come home at 11. And they like to sit there for hours. I don't do that. I gobble coleslaw while working at the computer. Well, that's what I do. That's what I do. That's why my keyboard is all gluey. Right? Americans have a hard time thinking, for example, of the following. That it might be important, if you're troubled in your life, to transform the work experience. Might be more important for you than to get another $10 an hour. The work experience, the thing you do 5 days a week, pretty much from the time you get up in the morning, because you're getting ready to go to work, to the time you get home in the evening after you've traveled from your place of work. You put it together, that's the overwhelming bulk of your lifetime. The time that you're not dead. You're living. But we accept as a people work conditions that are absolutely atrocious. Time, pressure, speed, machinery we have to manage, and so on. Because that issue has not been a concern of American workers. It really hasn't. The Americans are concerned, how much am I going to get paid at the end of that day? And I'll take my pleasure in consumption. I'll suffer the work experience to have the consumer experience. The work experience is negative. The consumer experience is not just the positive. It is the measure of your worth, your success, your importance, what you've achieved in your life. It is the clear measure for everyone else and for you too. Okay, why is this so important? In order to make that point clear, I want to superimpose on this line a second line. And this line, same period of time, this line represents productivity. What does that mean? The amount of stuff produced by a worker per hour. That's all. The average, you're averaging, of course, the average quantity of output per worker's effort. You can measure in hours, days, doesn't matter. And I want you to notice something. The productivity also rose. And it actually rose at a slightly higher rate than the wages. In other words, and it's very important you understand this about America. Yeah.
So that's not it's not the difference between what they produce and what they actually earn for their.
I'm getting to that. You're ahead of me, but you're going in the right place. This is the output per hour. This is the wage per hour. The very thing I told you about, the ability of the worker to put aside the conditions of work, to basically give that to the employer. You pay me enough, I don't care what you do with my working time. I'll do it the way you want it, how you want it, under the conditions you provide, at the pace you insist on. I'll do all that. But you got to give me more. That's the deal. Okay? Because the worker permitted it. And because the employer discovered that this is a pretty good deal. I can pay my worker a bit more every year because I'm getting even more out of them every year. He let the production situation, the machinery, the organization of production. We are leaders in the world in streamlining. If any of you have ever interested in the name Frederick Taylor at the turn of the century, the Taylor system of, he was the first person in capitalist history to study in detail every step of the production process to what's called rationalize it, to make sure that the minimum time was used in moving the screw from over here into the piece of metal over there, and to make sure that this is a way of organizing production that doesn't take into account anything about the person doing the work. The person becomes the adjunct to the production process, a cog. The person who captures this best is, of course, not an economist, a dull group of people anyway, but Charlie Chaplin. If you ever have a chance to see his famous movie called Modern Times, how many of you have ever seen this? Wonderful. So you know what I'm talking about. The scenes in there are the capture by a genius. So right away you know you're out of economics. A genius who understood what it means to be an adjunct. For those of you who've seen the film, you remember when the factory boss has a machine that's going to save time on lunch. And they strap Charlie in, and the machine comes in this little tray. Remember that? And the little pusher pushes the food into the mouth, and then a little napkin thing comes and wipes his mouth, and there's a little glitch, and the repair guy is right there, and he happens to put two bolts, metallic bolts, up on the tray because he's paying attention to fix it. So along comes the thing, pushes the bolts, of course, in his mouth, and then cleans his mouth, and he has to choke himself. It's fantastic. It's a description of how efficiency in the factory dehumanizes the human being. That's America. That's why it was very important, right after Charlie did that film, to accuse him of being a communist and get him out of the country, which he left, went back to London and never came back to the United States. In any case, This history is remarkable. Capitalists were able to organize the production process so they got even more out of the worker than they paid him. Think of it like this. 2% increase, which is roughly what it was, year in and year out, in output. 1 to 1.25% increase in wages. So the capitalist gave the worker more, but got even more for himself. It was a good deal. It was the quintessential American deal. The American worker's standard of living rose 150 years. The capitalist got enough extra out of him that the capitalist was willing, he would have liked not to have to give it to him, but he was willing, under pressure, union pressure and all the rest of it, to pay workers more, because this was a deal that worked beautifully. And for 150 years, it's absolutely remarkable. Okay, in the 1930s, a crisis happened. But in order to understand the crisis, I have to first tell you what happens in 1970. An amazing thing happens in America, central to the crisis we're now in. This line flattens out and tends slightly down. The other line keeps right on going. In other words, since the 1970s, American producers, employers, have been able to keep improving the technological system to get rising productivity. No end to that. The genius of American producers to increase productivity has not stopped. Particularly if you remember what happens in the 1970s, what this is, we could go with one word: the computer. The computer that replaces people with machines so that each remaining worker can do much more than he or she could do before. So it's the continuation of a productivity boom largely built around all the things a computer enables an individual to produce. So
were there also more people on the labor market after 1970? I mean, why
yeah, this is all per worker, so it abstracts from that. Yes, we're going to come to that. But the crucial thing, the thing that changes, the thing that I want you to grasp as central to understanding this crisis is this story. What the hell happened? And first of all, if I've gotten any of it across to you, think. If you have a population, a culture, a whole way of existing that has been premised on 150 years of rising wages, and you stop, that's a trauma for a population. What are they going to do? Their whole basis. What basis? The basis for the sense of achievement. Rising consumption. Enabled by rising wages. It's over. It stops. What are these people going to do? Well, it's real simple. They got two choices. They can kiss rising consumption goodbye. But if I've gotten across what I've told you, there's no way on earth they're going to do that. That's their self-definition. That's how they think they've made it in the world. They want to bequeath to their children that. They want to give their kids a good education, better than they got. All those things that are part of their sense of themselves as good people, as successful people, as good parents, as whatever image you want. They're just going to say, well, economy doesn't work, that's it, give it all up. No, nobody does that. Nobody does that. Did they do it? No, they didn't do it. Not a big surprise. What did they try to do? They tried to continue increasing consumption even though they had no wage way to do it. And they found the way. And they were pioneers in this, the way Americans have been pioneers before. Only this one doesn't have a happy ending. You know how we know that? Because that's the crisis. Here's what they did for the last 30 years. Two things. One, they did more labor. You know, if the real wage per hour doesn't go up anymore, one way to respond is to do more hours. because you can't do the same number of hours because that's going nowhere, so you can do more hours. So the American household undertakes more hours. And here's how they do it. Daddy takes a second job if he only had one, or a third job if he had two. But that's on the tip of the iceberg. The big thing, the women. Out. All that crap. The woman must take care of the children. Yeah, sure. The woman must be at home. Yeah, sure. It all disappears. You know, I don't mean to be facetious. It's a big struggle inside every woman as she has to cope with this radically changed definition of what her life is and what she ought to be doing. And it goes very quickly, which is why it has caused such difficulty for women. And for the men too, of course, because they have to adjust also to all these changed roles and positions. The women go out. They can now do more hours paid to bring in more money so the standard of living can be maintained and even raised a little bit. Teenagers are now, do a little work here, sweetie pie. You may only be 15, but babysit or something. And the old people, the retirement, come out of retirement, do something, a few hours, maybe a part-time, help. So the American family sends out its people to work more. That's one of the reasons that number I gave you, Americans work more hours than other people. That's a 30-year program to work more hours. It's not some mistake. It's not some peculiarity of our personality as a nation. That's an accommodation of a population to a traumatic event. And I'm going to explain to you as we go along why this happened. Right now I'm giving you the overview, so the explanations will make sense. The American family discovered this wasn't enough. Turns out that when mother leaves, when the woman leaves the household and takes a paid job, there are expenses. In America we have no public transportation, so the woman has to have a car. And she has to have outfits. She can't run around in that moo-moo. She can't do that. She has to have, an appropriate work outfit. And instead of making, a sandwich for herself at home, she has to spend money on the lunch and the travel and, the whole business. And it turns out she makes more money, but the family has more expenses. This kind of cancels out. So the American family does a second thing over the last 30 years to cope. You all know what that is. It borrows money. It borrows more money than any working class in the history of this planet ever borrowed before. Per person, per household, you name it, we're pioneers. Americans went crazy in borrowing. Never before in American history, and never anywhere else like this. 20 years, 30 years, from the mid-70s roughly, boom, we borrow. Americans borrow. First, of course, before borrowing, they begin to work down their savings. They had some savings. In the 1970s, Americans had savings. You know what? Today, Americans have no savings. We have a negative savings rate in the United States. We don't save anything. We spend our income. We used to save we don't save anything. So first you don't save anything, and then you borrow. So Americans have now 30 years of no savings and rising debt. Average debt in the United States is now 140% of your annual income. When we went into the Great Depression, the average debt of the American family was 20% of its annual income. You notice anything? Debt. Fantastic debt. Well, for a while it worked. It worked. First, the debt was based on, I'm going to do this in detail later, but quickly for the overview. First, the debt was based on what? Well, if American workers are going to borrow their way into growing in consumption because their wages will no longer go up, they will have the same problem we noticed before with the government. Who the hell is going to lend to them? American workers are not a good bunch to lend to. They don't have much. What do they have that a bank who lent to them could accept as a collateral, would make them not so risky? A house. So the first and still the greatest basis of all consumer debt is the house. The land and the building of the house. And the bank says, we'll lend you money, but if you don't pay it back, we're going to snatch your house because it's the only thing of value you have. Collateral is not interesting if it is, for example, underpants or shoes or toothbrushes. Banks seem not to want to accumulate large stocks of those. But a house, which they don't want either, you can see that now, but it's better than those things. So Americans' hunger for credit was so enormous. And the banks discovered early in the 70s and 80s, American borrower was fantastic. He or she was driven in a way they had never foreseen. They didn't understand this the way you now do. And what the American banks discovered is a level of desperation that makes the American worker the best patsy any lender could ever want. Somebody who borrows out of abject desperation. It's psychological, but that doesn't make it any less powerful. So banks began to discover that there's a second way to lend to Americans. Those who have no house, or to whom you've already lent all that you could lend on the house. So American banks invented in the 1970s something new. It's that piece of plastic in your wallet. It's called a credit card, which didn't exist before that. That was invented by the American Express Company and led the way, but I'm not talking about its existence, I'm talking about its existence as a mass phenomenon. Credit card debt. What is credit card debt for those of you that are not familiar? It's called in economics unsecured debt. That means it has no collateral. When you take out a mortgage, if you ever looked at a mortgage is a document in which the bank gives you a loan and you pledge that if you do not pay back that loan at the interest rate every month the way is listed in your document, the bank can take your house. It takes your house, it sells your house to get the money to repay itself what you owe them, and if there's anything left, it gives it to you. That's what a mortgage is. So it's a loan secured by your house as backing. A credit card has no backing at all. It's just your promise to pay. And so the bank said, whoa, we're taking a risk. But we all know what a bank does when it takes a risk. It covers itself by charging a much higher rate of interest. So loans on mortgages in America for most of these 30 years were in the nature of 4 to 6 to 7% per year. Credit card debt, 3 times, 4 times that. Credit card debt in the United States now 18, 19%, something in that area. Mortgage rate debt's now even lower, 4% or something like that. So you get the relationship? But Americans did it. I won't embarrass you in the room by asking how many of you do it. You borrow and you pay. And a genius psychologist came up with the idea, write the monthly bill in the credit card in the following way. You owe $4,622.18. What we need you to pay this month is $11. Oh, you all say, I can do that. And gleefully you write an $11 check. That's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to pay the least possible and keep building up borrowing that you're paying 18% per year to carry. The American working class was so determined to keep accumulating consumption because it was what life was about, what life was for, what success they had struggled for meant. That they borrowed and they borrowed and they borrowed. Yeah.
Just one other thing is that it somehow developed that the higher credit line you had, the better person you were somehow.
Absolutely. Those of you who ever had the credit, many of you must have gone through this, right? Periodically, I've had that. The credit card company, I worked with Citibank. I have to remember, there is no more Citi. I don't know if you read today's newspaper. The government is basically about to take over Citibank, and it's already a government bank. It's not going to be officially a government bank. In any case, I have a Citibank credit card, and periodically they write me a letter which goes something like this. Dear sir, we are so deeply in love with you that we are raising your limit. Your limit used to be $6,400. Now it's going to be $8,900. And then there's 3 paragraphs of what you say, telling me what a wonderful person I am. And what this is a vote of it's a cultural artifact. You ought to keep these letters and frame them, because these are ways of the society say, see, you've arrived. You're a good person. Here, you idiot, borrow more. Borrow more. Well, if flattery gets you to borrow at 18%, I'll flatter you from here to tomorrow. Of course, why not? Okay, so what do we have? We have 25 years of borrowing. So now what happens? As the banks discover the amount of money to be made lending to the desperate American consumerist working class, they go nuts. What I'm about to tell you, if you grasp this, you'll understand the genius of American capitalism and also its Achilles heel. As corporations made fantastic profits, all corporations. Why? Well, ask yourself, if you're a company whose workers keep producing more and more each year, but you don't have to pay them anymore each year, don't need an advanced degree. I get more from each worker, but I don't give him any more. All the extra from the productivity is me. I'm the employer. I keep it. I get more and more from the worker. I don't have to give him anything. It's all for me. This period, profits, which is the distance between these 2 lines, gets bigger and bigger. This is called the last 25-year boom. That's why we had a stock market explosion in the 1990s. That's why we had a profit boom. That's why the rich got richer and the rest of us sitting here. Right? But here's the punchline. These rich people took these enormous profits and put them in the bank. And what did the banks do with them? They had to find a profitable way to use them. I just told you what they found. The banks took the profits deposited in them and lent it to the workers. Are you with me now? If you lump together the business, the profit capitalists, and the banks, they're interwoven anyway, what American capitalism achieved in the last 30 years was to stop paying workers higher wages and instead to lend them the money. Hey, imagine yourself a business executive. And let me repeat what I just said. For 30 years, instead of paying the workers more wages, as you've been doing for 150 years, you gave them loans, which they had to pay back with interest. This is too good. This is too good. This is gooder than anything we could have imagined. The business school never told us it would be this good. And in the craze, as often happens in periods of profit, capitalists go nuts. So they began at the end of this period, starting around 2000, to say, okay, we've lent to all the people who have mortgaged their houses, and we've lent to all the people who can take out credit cards. We now have to, who can lend to? I know there's about 25% of the people that are so piss poor that they have no house and we'll never give them a credit card. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to approach them and say, we want to lend to you too. Who are these people? They have a peculiar name. They're called the subprime borrower. A nice way of saying the 25% piss poorest people in the country. And we're going to lend to them. And guess what? When you have, after 25 years of a lending spree, the likes of which the world has never seen, which is now stretched to lending to people who you never lent to before for a damn good reason, because they can't pay it back, you're going to get to the point where you've overdone it. You've lent to people who can't in a million years pay it back. And that's what happened last year. The mass of people who had been given these loans in the go-go days when everything was working got to the point where they couldn't anymore. 14% of the disposable income of an American, that's the amount of money you get after you pay taxes and basic things, is now used for what's called debt service. $1 out of $7 at the American work after the taxes. You're spending money. You can't spend on anything because you got to pay off your debts. Okay? So what's happening is they can't anymore. But they can't make it. They're paying off their debts. There's not enough for the food, the shelter, and for that mortgage of the house they can't afford. All the details of this you're going to get. But in a way, this crisis that explodes in the last 2 years was built up over this whole period of time by the rising wage story, by its relationship to the productivity story, by whatever happened in the 1970s, which we're all going to explain, you're going to understand that perfectly, creates a profit boom on the one hand, this widening, a crisis for the working class resolved by excess work and debt. So by 2007, profit is going mad with speculation. That's why we had the stock market crash of 2000 and the wildness of that you may remember. And we have the desperation of a working class that is physically exhausted and anxiety ridden up the wazoo because they know it can't carry the debt. You lose work for 3 months, you're finished, everything is lost. And I haven't even begun to tell you all the crisis of the American family when mother leaves. Mother is what holds the American family together under all this stress. And when you take mother out of the house and send her off to work, she can't do that anymore. American women, particularly women who are married and with children, are the largest consumers of legal and illegal drugs in the world. No other population, male or female, comes close. What is that about? Do we have a souped up female population in America? Is something wrong with you all? You've put these people under a level of stress that explains why any population under that stress would be taking every Prozac, every antidepressant, the people of this country are exhausted on every level that we can measure. And that's one of the reasons why this is not one of your run-of-the-mill business cycles. This is the big one. Biggest in our lifetime.